Hello, everyone. My name is Annie Cahill. I am a GIS technical consultant with Datamark, and I am here today to talk to you guys about addressing and all of the wonderful things that implies. This is one of several trainings that Datamark has developed in conjunction with the state of Oklahoma. Many of you have already been through our toolkit class. We also have an introduction to ArcGIS class, as well as a boundary facilitation class. So this is probably the most significant for a lot of you. The addressing situation nationwide is kind of mystifying, and you find it done differently no matter where you are. So I wanted to share with you all how you can do addressing in your community and what some best practices are. Okay, so I again am a GIS technical consultant with Datamark. That is my contact information if you guys have any questions. I have been an addressing authority. I live in Virginia and I also manage GIS data for public safety. And I've also done a lot of work for public safety. So I have a lot of experience in this area. So our agenda is we're going to talk about an introduction to addressing and kind of like how it got started, what's the purpose. We're going to discuss addressing for public safety. We're going to talk about some best practices. We are going to talk about creating sustainable addressing workflows. And then I'm going to review some local examples that were submitted for the folks who registered for the in-person class. Okay, introduction to addressing. All right, so quiz. Addressing is a function of the US Postal Service. True or false? False. A lot of people still think that it is. I actually worked with the community in Maryland and they told me that they were sending people to the post office for their addresses. This is kind of a nightmare. The post office is a consumer of addresses and they use them for point of service delivery for mail, but they should not be assigning addresses. An address can be assigned without a structure present. This is true. We are assigning addresses to a lot of different things these days. And NG911 is really compelling us to have a closer look, maybe more critical look at how we're assigning numbers. So you can assign them without a structure being present. Addressing is mission critical to all government functions. True or false? True. Everyone uses addresses across the government enterprise. And finally, subaddressing isn't that important to maintain. True or false? That is false. Subaddressing is incredibly important to maintain, especially when we're talking about addressing for public safety. All right, so now let's get into the history and legacy of addressing. So the origins of addressing, it really was more about location description, such as I will meet you at the Fox and Hound pub, or giving directions, turn left at the Windy Mermaid and then right at the Broken Wagon, or go to the building with the apple and wreath on the front of it. Lots of descriptions being given to physical locations for location navigation. Later on, we saw a need for actual site addresses for things like the census. As we started developing a census, we needed to have a precise way to associate the population with individual locations. And then, of course, two very important things for conscription and tax collection, especially, people are really needing addresses for that individual location identification. So most of us would associate a point of service delivery with an address, right? Like for me, Amazon is very important. And that's one of the reasons why I have this silly meme on here because um, addressing is extremely important for Amazon delivery, right? So that's pretty much my perspective of point of service, using an address. A lot of people also still get pizza delivered. Maybe they're using Uber Eats or Grubhub. So anything that's a point of service to your home. A lot of people might think of public safety as kind of a secondary because they have not had the misfortune of having to dial 911 for an emergency at their home. But this is really the most important reason for addressing. Yes, we want our mail, we want our pizza, we want our Amazon deliveries, but the public safety component is the most important thing. All right, so legacy systems have really evolved over the years, and we've seen a lot of evolution, changes, broken systems, patchwork of systems, and a lot of those are resulting from different things. So, number one, the change in boundaries between the jurisdictions. This could be through annexations, but often if you have a more urban area that goes into a more rural area, you can actually see a change in the addressing systems, because not every addressing system is appropriate for every type of geography. Okay, so you might see within an urban area that you'll have directionals that are used maybe in a downtown area, whereas if you get out into the county, you might have less of that and more of just unique street names. Some communities don't even have unique street names. They just go with, or named street names, I should say. They just go with numbered names that are assigned by the locality. So there's lots of different ways that you see different addressing systems come together in different locations. We also have had to deal with a lack of information over the years that has led to some irregularities in different addressing systems, like driveway access. Long driveways can upset the intent of different addressing systems. The number of lots. How many lots do you have versus how many addresses are available? Those have also impacted our legacy addressing systems. And then, of course, sometimes you see things that are irregularities because there have been no ordinances or SOPs established within that jurisdiction. Very, very important. SOPs are critical for helping define your actual process internally. And then, of course, the ordinances are the legally documented code for how you're going to go about enforcing that. And if there's no ordinance, a lot of times there's been no enforcement. So you have these things that just kind of remain in the addressing system in real life and in the GIS data. Okay. So as far as the current state of addressing, we already kind of went over the fact that our addressing systems are kind of a patchwork, right? And it was done that way for a number of different reasons: annexations, geography, different people assigning addresses. But there's a lot of different reasons of how we got to the way that we are today in our different addressing systems. So addressing is determined locally. This is a locally driven process by someone within the city, town, or county. Okay, this can be within real estate, public works, inspections, planning and zoning, GIS, IT, public safety. Addressing authorities are found everywhere. And depending on where the addressing authority is located, that can definitely have an impact on what that addressing actually looks like in current day. The public perception often is that addressing is a function of the USPS. And again, that's because people associate addressing with point of service delivery, with their mail. There are often no standard systems of record for addressing. So, a lot of people have the addressing systems that they do today. They may or may not have a good record of those systems. Often the clients with whom I work as part of the strategic planning process, they don't know where their original addressing grid is or where their original addressing maps are located. So really what they're doing is just kind of interpolating the address based on the location, which is not wrong. It's not incorrect. It's just a function of the fact that there's no systems of record. And then, of course, a disparity in resources in managing the addressing information. If you're a self-addressing municipality, you may struggle with this. You may not have GIS. You might just put addresses down in an Excel file or in a Microsoft Word document, or you may just email it out. So lots of people have different ways of managing their addressing information. So state and local governments run on addresses. I cannot think of a single department in local government that does not use addressing data. whether it's in a tabular form, like in a database, or whether it's in a spatial form, like an address points data set in GIS, or maybe it's an address that's associated to a parcel of land. Everyone uses addresses. So the addressing authority. Local standards are usually a customization of the nationally recommended methods. I would like to say that this is typical, but it's not. I think in the more developed offices, where you have a lot of GIS driving the addressing as part of their business processes, you do see an adopted nationally recommended methods, but that's not always the case. We've seen a lot of data that is very random. There's no standardization. Um, so everyone is kind of doing it differently. I think that as far as a standard, Oklahoma's doing a great job because Oklahoma has a state standard. And so the state standard is actually built on the national standard. And what they've done is they have adopted the national standard and then added their own twist to it. So basically they've added some extra fields in the addresses and the road center lines, feature classes. They've also included an extra feature class in the state model for NG911. So they have taken the steps to standardize addressing with the understanding that everyone is doing addressing differently at the local level. And obviously the goal is to standardize that data so it can be pushed into a larger, not just statewide, but national data set. Okay. And that's really the goal. So when we're talking about addressing and next generation 911, we really want to be careful because it's not just about your city, your town, your county. It's about, and not just about the state, it's about the entire nation. So if my PSAP in Virginia fails, one of your PSAPs in Oklahoma should be able to route the call. Okay. The addressing authority may also want to establish an address review committee. I have worked in a couple of places that have an addressing committee, and I would say that it has been very fruitful. You have different agencies included within the addressing committee, and these are all key stakeholders that are consumers of addresses. Like I said, whether it's in a tabular form, like a database, or a spatial form, like a GIS address points file. These are consumers of addresses who rely on them not just for internal business processes, but also for real world location identification. Okay, so public safety is an obvious one. Whereas public works or utilities, they may also need to see that information in real time out in the field so that they can go, do whatever they need to do. So an addressing committee that takes all of the stakeholders into account has proven to be very successful in a lot of different areas. The addressing authority should also understand addressing for public safety, which is why I'm assuming you all are tuning in today to this training, because addressing for public safety may be very different than what you are used to or what you have been trained to do. Maybe you're in planning and zoning and you've only done parcel addressing. But there is an increased need for education for public safety addressing specifically because of the fact that addresses should primarily serve our first responders. And then, of course, the addressing authority also should establish ordinances and SOPs. This is extremely important. So we've already kind of gone over this, but I will say the addressing for public safety is the most important takeaway for this. And I think that a lot of you, like I mentioned before, will benefit from this if you do not have a public safety background or if you've never done addressing for public safety. So let's talk about the reasons why addressing is so important for public safety. So the first reason is because addressing is supposed to be easy to understand, right, and to comprehend. So if I'm driving down a street and I see 100 on my right, logically, I would say, okay, my addresses should increase as I'm driving down the street. So 100, 104, 110, 150, 116, etc. So I'm seeing a logical and comprehensive numbering system that makes sense. The numbers are in order. I can expect that they're going to increase as I'm driving down the street. Okay, so basically, we need to create a set of guidelines to support our public safety first responders in using our addressing systems. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier to you that different systems may apply depending on the type of geography that you're working with. Okay. And the municipal boundaries. Generally, where you have downtown areas, more urban, tightly compact areas, those are going to use a different addressing system than rural areas. Okay. And I also want to add that for public safety, you know, I have seen a lot of weird stuff. So we don't want to see evens and odds on the same side of the street. That's not a best practice. I mean, we'll go over all of this later, but this stuff does occur in real life. And it is important to get ahead of this and be proactive rather than reactive. So let's talk about what an addressing system actually is. They are rules that define the order and placement of addresses within a geographic area. So saying, hey, evens on the right, odds on the left. If I have an area where the lot sizes are a quarter acre or less, we're going to use consecutive numbering, things of that nature. Okay. There should be a visible logic in the way the numbers are assigned and posted. So the assignment is one part of it, but the posting is the other. And your ordinances should cover all of that information. Okay. So, I mentioned before that the numbers should be sequential, and as you're driving down the street, you really want them to increase as you're driving down the street. Okay. So some numbering systems will have an origin point. Where I live, for example, we have an actual incorporated city that's geographically located within the county, and it's its own city, and it has its own grid system. But as the county, our origin point was physically located within that city. And as you kind of like increase in distance out from that origin point, the numbers increase, and the numbering actually starts on a street wherever that is closest to the origin point. So some places have an origin point that's kind of like in the middle. If you're using a grid system, sometimes the origin point begins at one corner of the grid. Again, it really just depends on the numbering system. Odds, evens, we've kind of talked about already with the parity. Parity refers to, okay, odds are on the left, evens are on the right. That's a best practice. You can have a parity of both, but that is not a public safety best practice. It's more of like to accommodate situations where that type of addressing has occurred, where you've got evens and odds on the same side. Some numbering systems increment, and some have blocks. So you'll have like 1,000 block or a 2,000 block. And then, of course, the different street name elements. Do you have directionals? Do you have post directionals? So common addressing systems, block addressing, generally you're going to increase by 100 each block, or whatever the addressing system starts at. Okay. Addresses usually increase by 2 or 4, and usually you see this in smaller lot subdivisions. Okay. Grids follow section lines. They are usually in 1,000-foot increments, and they have larger numbers. Grids are not great when it comes to assigning on circular or very curved roads. Distance-based addressing is where you assign based on the distance along a road, and the parity is based on the side of the road. So if you have, most people will follow the 5.28 feet, which is kind of like a NENA standard for address assignment, but there are other increments as well. A lot of you use a combination of these addressing systems. So for example, in my community, we use distance-based and we use block. For, distance-based was for the larger, more rural areas where you had, a half acre or more family subdivisions or rural, areas like farms. But then we also use block because we had a lot of like small lot developed subdivisions that were going in, and they were quarter acre or less. And so those were, those started at 100 and increased by 2. So 100, 102, 104, 106 would be on the right-hand side. And then the opposite would be the odd numbers. A lot of you, I didn't put this on here because a lot of you also use what I call winging it. And winging it is actually more of like an interpolation type method where you are going out in the field and you see, okay, to my left, I have 101. And then maybe a few lots down, but on the same side of the street, you've got a 107. So what lot, what address should the lot in between have? Okay, let's call it 103 or something like that. So that's kind of what a lot of you are using, especially if you cannot easily identify your addressing system or any historical records pertaining to that. Not surprised, most of our addressing systems are 40 years old at this point. So it makes sense that paperwork would have gotten lost or destroyed over time. And so now you're just kind of trying to make the best of it. But our systems are locally determined. All right, so this is an example of a block addressing system where you have a block that starts at one intersection and goes to another, and it actually changes. So if you look at this intersection here, the numbering starts at 100, and then as we get to this intersection with Cedar Mountain Drive, it actually changes to a 200 block. So it's very common to see the blocks change at four-way intersections. A grid addressing system. The grid on the left was actually provided to me by a client a long time ago. The addressing starts in the northeast corner. You see where it has all those zeros? That's where their addressing system starts. So as you increase going out from that 00 point, the numbers will increase as well. And you see that those numbers are much larger. So those lines are intervals of 1,000, and the lines are separated by 1 mile intervals. Okay. Whereas on the right-hand side, they have some directionals assigned based on their grid system. This is also very common that there's a standard for directionals no matter what. Some communities have a mix of directionals and non-directionals, and they have 400 numbers per mile, so every 13.2 feet. So grid systems can be gridded out differently depending on the geography, and usually grids, addressing systems in general, are established by different consultants. So it really just depends on the geography and how they have chosen to do it. But this is just 2 examples of 2 different grid systems. So distance-based numbering is very common for a lot of communities, especially rural communities with larger lots. So essentially, 5.28 feet is the example that's provided here. And what's been done is the distance has been measured. So the example here is 1408 Main Street. So this address is 7,438 feet from where the road starts at its intersection with Smith Road. So they've taken that measurement, 7,438 feet, and divided it by the 5.28 feet to obtain the number, which is 1408. So that's how you would do that. And you could do that mathematic calculation with whatever your interval is. It may be bigger than 5.28 feet. The reason for 5.28 is because it gives you 1,000 addresses per mile. So you can allow for a lot of infill in that situation. If you've got a lot of sub-addressing, or if you're anticipating a lot of development, that 5.28 feet is a very healthy distance to get you the addressing that you need without running out. Okay, so that's distance based. Okay, so streets really begin the foundation of the addressing system. Okay, addressing is organized around the street network, and we've already talked about the different types of geographies, like urban areas where you have really tight geographic layout of different street networks. Rural areas often can follow topographic features, not always, but they do. Um, and then some of you may have areas that have no roads. We actually have some clients where they say, hey, we've got this little island that has, 15 or 20 homes on it. How do we go about addressing that? Um, some of you have subdivisions or street names that are organized based on a theme. So, often you'll go through and see plant communities or there's one near me that's named after different types of horses. Um, there's another one that's named after different types of like it's got different types of boating terminology, like for the road names. Kind of interesting. Um, and like I said before, there are some communities that don't even deal with named streets. They just number the streets, and that way keeps things simple, keeps things unique, and they don't have to worry about, having duplicate names. And then, of course, there's a question about, hey, do we or do we not use duplicates? Or I'm sorry, directionals. And then, the other challenge for people managing addressing is, what do I do with stuff that's a duplicate or things that sound phonetically similar? And a duplicate, by the way, it doesn't make it not a duplicate if you change a suffix. So if you have a green street and a green road, that's still a duplicate. Some places don't consider that, but that is a duplicate, period. Just because you change a suffix doesn't mean that it's not a duplicate. If someone is at an individual's home for a pool party and they have a child that's drowning and they're not familiar with the area, they're going to know green. That's all they're going to know. They're not going to be able to tell you in a moment of panic what the street suffix is. So this is why we have to be very thoughtful about our road naming. So some common addressing challenges: number one, long driveways. Long driveways or multiple entrances into a property can be very challenging to addressing authorities, because it's like, okay, well, which is the primary? Which one is being used? Can we take emergency vehicles down a specific road? Range management. Actual ranges versus theoretical ranges. Actual ranges mean that my road range represents what's actually out there for addresses. So if I have a range, if I have my lowest address is 100 and my highest address is 128, then my range is going to be 100 to 129. As opposed to a theoretical range, which is the entire block. So saying this is the 100 block, you would say 100 to 199. Okay. How do you manage those ranges? A lot of people want me to pick sides here, and I can't, because it's not appropriate. Both are acceptable. And you can use both within an addressing system. You just have to know when it's appropriate to use either one. Okay, actual ranges are better in rural areas, and theoretical ranges are better in urban areas where you have tight or compact address ranges. Okay. Infill addressing: when you start to have people adding on to homes, they're moving mom in or grandma or whoever, and they've got to have a separate address. Or if, somebody builds an apartment above a garage and they want to start renting that out, what do? Do you give it a primary? Do you assign it a sub off of the main? That's infill addressing. Annexations are a huge challenge for a number of different reasons for addressing authorities. But for addressing specifically, it's kind of the question, well, should I change addresses after I annex, or should I just leave the addresses the way that they are? Even though they're coming into the city, should I leave them as county addresses? Sub-addressing, very challenging. Again, there seems to be a lot of mystery around how to assign sub-addressing, but it's one of those things that is extremely important. The lack of public safety engagement and addressing is very obvious when I go into communities. I get a lot of complaints from public safety concerning um, very specific types of things like college campuses, areas where there are multiple structures and there's only one address, um, areas where there have been people allowed to assign their own sub address, and that's never been reported back to the addressing authority. So now you have missing addresses. So it's a huge concern for a number of different reasons. And all of this has to do with location validation and location identification. Lack of GIS resources is huge. Do you keep a record of your addresses in GIS? If you don't, you're going to have to start somehow. So one thing I didn't mention here is that there are two of the biggest challenges that I've identified with addressing specifically. The first is the sub addresses. The second is when you have self-addressing municipalities, they assign their own numbers and then they don't report it back to the larger county. And some places might think, well, who cares? What's the big deal? It's my addressing. Well, the problem there is that you're not thinking broadly enough, because when there's an emergency, who are the resources coming from? Right? It's not just about your municipality. Like if you're expecting public safety services from the county, you need to make sure that they are aware of that information and informed so that they can find you. That's the whole point. So those are the two most mismanaged parts of addressing that I've been able to identify. So sub addresses is basically additional information to differentiate specific locations, right? So within a structure itself, so for example, an apartment building with 8 apartments, it's one building, but there's 8 dwelling units within, or within a group of structures. So an industrial area or a college campus, rather, let's use that example, a college campus that has 10 buildings. Do they get primaries or do they get subs? So it's a way of differentiating multiple structures from one another, or dwelling units or units within another building from one another. Sub addresses can also be used to reflect common names. And I will say that the data model, the Oklahoma state model, does allow for sub addressing down to the seat level. This is not something that I recommend, specifically because of the level of effort that's involved. It will drive you crazy. You need to make sure that you're able to dedicate ongoing resources if you're going to get that detailed. I would say if you can get down to the floor, that would be super helpful, and be able to identify, okay, you've got apartments 1 through 4 on the bottom, etc. That's the best thing to do, is to get down to the floor and the apartment. To the seat level is a little much, and I think it's too big of a level of effort for most people. Okay, so some examples of sub-addressing include different schools, college campuses, high school. My high school had obviously several structures. There was the main school building. There was also athletic buildings. We also had trailers that were outside for additional learning because there wasn't room in the actual school. So there are lots of different types of schools that have different addressing scenarios. Hospitals and health complexes. Many of you are already familiar with apartments or condos, mobile home parks, industrial complexes, shopping centers. All of these are examples of sub-addressing. So sub-addressing challenges. So for the addressing authority, often we struggle with inconsistent addressing. Is it unit or apartment? At the availability of addressing. Do I have enough addresses available to do what I need to do? How do I keep track of this information? If someone is not using GIS, maintaining the data might be very difficult. You might have it recorded as 147-7 Main Street when it's really 147 Main Street, apartment 7. Ordinance support for sub-addressing is also tricky because a lot of our ordinances are super old and out of date. The question of whether or not to assign primaries versus assigning actual sub-addressing. Sometimes it may be more appropriate to assign an individual address over a sub for more precise location validation and identification. The workflows and communication process concerning sub-addressing can be challenging. I have gone into several communities where they've told me, yes, we assign the primary and then we leave it up to the developer or the property owner to assign sub-addresses. So that information is never communicated back, it's never recorded, and often it is done incorrectly because the developer is unaware of how to assign a sub-address for public safety. So for GIS, the challenges can be, how do I place these addresses? If I have 8 apartments, what do I do? Do I place them on top of the building footprint? Do I stack them all? How do I place these address points? Managing the level of detail, like we mentioned, can be very challenging. And then, of course, the data quality issues that come from that. Having 8 address points that all say 147 Main Street is fine, but you have to make sure that you are providing additional context. You shouldn't have duplicate addresses. And for public safety, of course, routing the appropriate resources could be a challenge. First responder safety, delayed response time, signage issues, forcing addresses in CAD. And then I do have an example and a story that I'm going to tell you, but it's not in the next slide. It's a few slides down. So one document that I would highly recommend that you reference is called the NENA Site Structure Address Point Informational Document. And it starts with an INF, and that tells you that it's an informational document. It's not a standard. So these are not hard and fast rules for address assignment, okay? An informational document is just providing information. I know it sounds kind of silly, but that's literally what it's doing. So what it will do, and these screenshots, by the way, came directly out of that document. What it will do is it'll show you a scenario like this, and then it will take you through different ways to do the address or to represent it. So it's not endorsing one specific methodology or another. NENA recognizes that it is putting a requirement on a locality to manage addressing, okay? And for that reason, it's saying, hey, you know what? Something is better than nothing. So it's better for you to have some type of address than nothing at all. So if all you can do is have an address point that's a parcel centroid, hey, they'll take it, okay? But the more precise you can be, the better. And that's what you're going to get from me or from Datamark that you're not getting from the informational document, is we will tell you what the best approach is for these different scenarios. So the original scenario provided is an address of 100 for, we can assume, all 5 of these buildings. Okay, obviously this can get extremely confusing. And so my recommendation is, in the right picture, is to assign an individual primary address off of Conifer Circle for each one of these buildings. Okay, and then you can actually assign sub-addresses to the apartments within. If you wanted to put a building number on the outside, you could do that too. But then, of course, you would need to make sure that the building is posted, or the building number. So if you were going to just have one primary address, the building number becomes more important. But if you're just going to do one primary per building, then you would have the actual number, the building number, the primary address number posted on the outside of each building. And that is, for me, what I would consider the best approach for NG911, because you're providing a level of precision for each building, and then assigning it a sub-address within for each apartment. For a business or industrial area, you could have one address for the entire complex. Okay, but this can get very complicated because, as you know, in some of these areas, you may have like an office area. You may have a storage area. You could have a receiving area, warehouse. There's lots of different types of structures that could be at one location. So I recommend that you do primaries, and then you also further differentiate with some additional location information in the model. And when you pull up the state model, you'll see all of the different addressing fields that are available to you. For a mobile home park, this is actually reversed. The slide on the right, one address for all of these mobile home parks, for me is really not appropriate. I actually was working on a project. Oh, I guess it was maybe like a year and a half ago now, or almost 2 years ago, where there was a fatality in a mobile home park because of an addressing scenario just like this. There was inappropriate addressing in the mobile home park and someone died. And then there was subsequent litigation. So I think that, in general, we should probably stop looking at mobile home parks as something different than, a normal addressable structure. I think that, yes, mobile homes can be moved out and moved in again, but I think if you allow enough addressing as lots are consolidated or subdivided, I think you should be able to assign primaries with no issue. So just to be clear, I think you should have individual street names within the mobile home park and then assign primaries off of each of those. So it would look more like what's going on the left-hand side, where you'd have an address point for each mobile home. And of course, the business park, very similar. You would want to do primaries. And if you had, any identifiable right-of-way within there, you would probably want to name those and assign primaries based off of those, just so you can avoid running out of addresses. So this college campus example, this is a campus where, we've become aware of this situation on this college campus due to some meetings that we were having as part of strategic planning process. And part of what was identified through that process is that the college campus has many, many buildings with one address, and the first responders are bringing paper maps onto the campus when they have a 911 call, and they are unable to differentiate what building is what based on the paper map, because there's, I guess, things are not posted appropriately. There's different things going on. So they're having to call back into the PSAP to get better location information. And of course, you can imagine the amount of time that this takes. So one of the things that we did was we sat down with the folks at the college and also within the town in which the college is located, because they are the actual addressing authority. And then we sat down with the county themselves and we identified potential right-of-way within the college campus that could potentially be named. And they identified that as a potential opportunity for their benefactors to name roads. And so that's kind of an ongoing project, but this is something that we hope to resolve. And it is something where we've seen across the nation. This isn't just in one area. So we're hoping to see the fruits come out of this very soon. Okay, so best practices for address assignment. Let's review some resources. So the first is the Oklahoma NG911 GIS and addressing standard. Pull that up here. This is the addressing standard that you can find on the state's website. And essentially what this does is it has some tips and tricks for assigning addresses or, road names, but there is a whole bunch of information here. This is the most significant thing. So this is the addressing schema. And basically, if you look down here, you can see where you know, we've basically broken it down or parsed the individual elements, right? So you have your address number, you have a suffix, pre-modifier, pre-directional, pre-type. There's lots of different fields in here where you're going to have to divide up. So if you have 123 North Main Street, apartment 7, all in one column or field within your data, you're going to be expected to parse that out. But then down here, you can see the individual different sub-addressing components. And you see here, these are all optional. So you don't have to include them, but it is extremely useful to add additional context or location identification within your GIS data. So there's an additional location information field, which is super valuable. It provides a space for you, like if you have something like a loading dock that's the only way you can really describe it, then you can drop that here in this field. Again, you'll see floor, building unit, room, and seat. If you can get here to the floor and into the unit, that is going to be a fantastic level of information that you can provide to our first responders. Seat is extremely ambitious, like I said, but you would really need to make sure that you have the resources to dedicate to that. There are other ways of annotating location besides using a street address. A lot of people get really surprised when I say, hey, your actual your house number is actually conditional. Conditional means that it only has to be maintained if it already exists within the data. So there are some places that may not have an actual street address, like a number in a street. And you can provide additional context through things like the additional location information field, milepost. Also, you can use lat long as well. So don't kind of box yourself into thinking, oh, I can only assign an address based on a street number, because that's not always the case. And in some cases, it may be more appropriate to provide a latitude and longitude because there is no street name nearby. Okay, the second document that I'm going to show you is the NINA standard. And this is NINA STA. STA tells you that it's a standard. So these are rules and regs. And this is 006.2-2022. Okay. So this was approved in September of 22. And like immediately after they released the standard, they're already working on the next version. Okay. This is going to look very similar to the one that we just looked at, which was the state standard. And that's because the state standard models the national standard, right? This is the national standard. And the state standard has a few extra fields. So for example, here in the addressing, it has storm shelter. And this is not a field that's in the NINA standard. So if I scroll down and I go to address points and I look here, storm shelter is not in here. So, but the rest of the fields are. Okay. The next document is the site structure address point document. It's right here. And this is fantastic. I love this document. It's long. It's 62 pages. Okay. It's got a lot of information about pricing, about addressing different types of structures. Okay. So if I scroll down, see it's got lots of different scenarios, lots of different options. There's also a best practices section in here that you guys might find valuable. The thing about this is to understand that this is an information document. So the document, whereas before in this one, it was in NINA STA, the address point is an INF, which tells you that it's just kind of like an FYI. It's just information. It's not a standard. It's not holding you to a specific standard. It's just telling you, hey, this is kind of like an FYI for you guys. So that's the site structure address point document. And then finally, the GIS data stewardship. This one I'm really excited about because this was just released in 23. Again, this is another informational document. This is NENA INF 028.2-2023. This has a lot of really good information about maintaining your GIS data. And the good thing about these NENA documents, if you've never looked at them, is they have a fantastic table of contents that's really going to be used to help you navigate the document, because these documents contain information about everything: addresses, roads, boundaries. There's a lot of information here, great information about boundaries, that can be very, very useful to you. And this one was just published. So those are some resources that I think you all need to keep on hand. The good thing about the NENA documents is that you can actually download them and just keep them handy. I have a whole folder on my desktop that has all of the most up-to-date documents and even the older versions, just so I can kind of compare as the newer ones come out. Okay, so let's talk about some do's and don'ts for naming roads. Road names, roads, as I mentioned earlier, are critical for building the foundation of your addressing system. Okay, and consequently, you need to do a good job of managing these roads and overseeing the road naming process going forward within your communities. So the first thing is I think all of you need to start maintaining a master road name list if you don't already. This is something that actually, where I worked, we published this online. We actually had a database, and every time someone requested a road name, we would add it to the database, and that was published online and available basically to everyone. So if you were a developer and you wanted to come into the community, our policy was you cannot have a duplicate name or something that sounds phonetically similar. And again, a duplicate name, just because it has a different suffix doesn't disqualify it, or a different suffix but a same primary road name still disqualifies that road. So maintain a master road name list that, if you don't want to publish it online, that's okay, but it's something that everyone has easy access to, so that if somebody calls and says, hey, I want this name, you can double check it and say, no, that's not going to work because it's a duplicate. We already have, 15 desert whatever names. Okay. Include public safety in the naming and approval process. Let them have a shot at reviewing those plans or those proposed road names, because sometimes the way that the developers have come in and recommended different road configurations is not appropriate for public safety. You can't have a name that goes up only halfway and then takes a hard right at an intersection. That's not a best practice. Really should be a different name. So include public safety so they can also give it their review. And that master road name list is going to go a long way in helping everyone determine if the name is appropriate or not. When 3 or more structures share a right-of-way, or if the right-of-way is a half mile or greater, name it. And so that there was an original document a long time ago that referenced 2 structures sharing a right-of-way. I think that's a little ambitious, depending on what your road naming process looks like internally. It might be a lot for you to go chasing after, houses that, or structures that have, 2 or more. So I think 3 is appropriate. It depends on how much addressing you have, but I think as long as the address is posted at the end of the driveway, and it's clearly posted along with the road name, I think you're going to be okay. I think that's okay. I wouldn't do 2. It's just a lot. It's a lot of work. It can be a lot of expense depending on who's paying for the road signs. But again, it's up to you. You can do 2, 3, 4 or more, but you want to make sure that if it's that many, or if the driveway or the right of way is a half mile or longer, name it, because often you can't see structures clearly from the road. So it helps to name it so it doesn't just look like a path that goes into nothing. Okay. Naming roads now prevents an addressing shortage later. All right. So often when you have long driveways that access a lot of structures, you can run out of addressing along that main road. So the best thing to do is to go ahead and name that road so you have a fresh addressing available. You should follow USPS Publication 28 for different suffix standards and prefix standards. Avoid duplicate names or names that sound phonetically similar. Again, a suffix does not make a name unique, because generally a 911 caller cannot, depending on what's going on, they may not be able to give you that level of detail. They may only know the street name. In my community where I live, there are 3 different Mulberries: Mulberry Street, Mulberry Terrace, and Mulberry Court, I think. And that was not within our limits or our purview, so we couldn't fix it. But can you imagine if there was a terrible emergency that happened on one of those streets and all you know is, hey, I'm on Mulberry, I don't know what the suffix is? You don't want to put people in that position to have to make that distinction. Abbreviated names, numeric names. I'm not saying that First Street is wrong. It's just that it can get confusing, especially if you are doing one ST as a number and then first spelled out. So make the differentiation, and basically we would not allow numeric names, but if that's part of your community's way that they number roads or that they name roads, then that's okay. But just make sure that again, it's not duplicated. Names with punctuation, keep it fully spelled out. And then directionals, avoiding directionals can be kind of an inflammatory recommendation. Directionals can be confusing, especially when you've already got duplicate names. So if your community relies on directionals and that's part of the navigational component for your first responders, then by all means keep them. But if it's a community where you have a mix, I would try to avoid them if you can. Again, especially if there's a duplicate. So for addressing dues, assign numbers to all inhabited structures. At a minimum, you need to make sure that everybody that's living somewhere has an address. For corner lots, assign those based on the front door. A lot of corner lots, I mean, really, you could have 2 potential addresses, right? And we would do what we would call pre-addressing, where we would actually assign 2 potential numbers on a corner lot. One to allow for a front door, one to really allow for each street on which the lot was fronting. So if we got the plan in and the front door was facing Main Street, then it would get a Main Street address. If it was on Green Street, it would get a Green Street address. And it doesn't matter if the driveway was off of one street and the house was off of another street. It was always going to go based on the front door, because first responders are going to go through your front door, not your garage. Okay. That's why we didn't do it based on the driveway. Consider future development. I mentioned earlier to you that 5.28 feet gives you a really good buffer for 1,000 addresses per mile. That's a ton of addresses. So if you are in a rapidly growing community, if you think you're going to need a lot of addresses, you can use that as the foundation for your addressing system. And then manage subaddresses. This is very important. We want to pack the record for our first responders. We want to make sure that when they pull up to a location, they know exactly what to expect as far as, okay, I'm going to go here. The first structure I'm going to come up to is 100. The structure right behind it is 104. The structure behind that is going to be 108. So you want to make sure that you're managing that and also documenting if there are other structures within. Okay, if I'm pulling up to an apartment building, how many apartments can I anticipate? Are there basement apartments? How can I anticipate those apartments? And how do I record those in my GIS? So you want to avoid street numbers longer than 6 characters, or addressing numbers rather. The longer addresses are very confusing. Long number strings are very confusing in an emergency. Fractionals, some places have no choice but to assign fractional addresses. My downtown area is like that because our community is like over 300 years old, and that's the only way to accommodate for these old colonial buildings that have, subdivided multiple times within. But as a general best practice, you want to avoid fractionals because they are confusing and they're hard to manage within the data, and they also can be a problem for first responders. Alphanumerics, you don't want to assign like a 1A. That's not appropriate. Assign an actual street number and then a subaddress off of that. And then hyphenated addresses, that's more of a way that people write out their mail. That's not an appropriate way of assigning an address. You're not going to do 100-1. It's 100, whatever Main Street, Unit 1. Okay. Some common addressing questions. I moved to a different location on my property or access my house from another road. Why can't I just take my address with me? You cannot take your address with you. The address is assigned to the structure, not the inhabitant or individual or property owner. Okay. If you take that address with you, it's going to upset the addressing system and you're probably going to end up with something that's out of order. So no, you cannot take an address with you. What is the difference in my 911 address and my actual address? Hopefully nothing. Okay, hopefully they are both the same. There should be no difference between your actual address and your 911 address. They should both be one and the same. What justifies a location getting an address? What is the criteria for assigning one? Well, I would say any location that's occupied full or part-time by a person should have an address. But of course, we know that there are different qualifying structures as well. So people assign them to utilities. People assign them to windmills. People assign them to garages or pole barns. Structures that are not really inhabited at all. They're just kind of there. And a lot of that is a function of needing to get power. But like I said earlier, really NG 911 requires us to have a more critical perspective about what we're assigning addresses to. Okay, it's not just a home or a business. We have to be very thoughtful about this. What is the criteria for assigning one? As far as the structure type, I think we just defined that. But I also think that to assign one, you need to ask the person for a detailed plat or map of their property and the property number, like the parcel ID number, for example, or the tax ID, whatever you guys call it in your communities. So you want to make sure that you have that information, you have the property lines, you have the structure location, and the driveway location is critical because on big properties, that is an absolute must. The post office tells me I have the wrong address and to call the local addressing authority. Now what? Call them. Call the local addressing authority. Get your address verified by them and get the address on official letterhead and then take it to the post office. The post office is not where you go to verify an address. Okay. GIS data management. So because this is about NG 911 as much as it is about addressing, it is important to understand that the way the data is drawn into GIS, that's going to have an impact on the functionality of the data. For example, addresses are supposed to be going in the same direction as the road. So like the road should be increasing in the direction of increasing addresses, if that makes sense. You start the road on the end with the lowest addresses, and then you draw it going in the direction of the increasing addresses. So the way that you draw in GIS data has a meaning when you're talking about managing this data for next generation 911. Okay, and I know this is just an addressing class, but we also need to be very mindful that this forms the foundation of how this data is going to be used. Okay, so the use of the data determines how it's drawn in GIS. So for example, a 2-lane bidirectional road may be represented with a single line with ranges on both sides. A normal bidirectional road, single line with ranges on both sides. Multi-lane roads with 2 or more lanes traveling in the same direction may be represented with 2 lines if a median or division is present. So you have a divided highway, you'll want to represent that with two lanes. And then the side that doesn't have addressing, like the side against the median, should have a 0, 0 address range. Okay. So there's different ways to collect and draw in roads. The first is using GPS. Some folks will use a collector app or something of that nature, and they will basically drive the roadway. Some folks will also use aerial photography, especially if you get updates every year or two. That's a great way to update your aerial or update your road center lines using the aerial photos. You can georeference from paper maps. One thing that you guys might want to consider is actually digital submission. And this is basically you would get this from developers, right? So they often, they're getting their paper plans from somewhere, and this generally is coming from their CAD line work. So, and this is CAD, computer aided drafting, not computer aided dispatch. So AutoCAD is computer aided drafting. So you would get the CAD files, which would be like a DXF or a DWG from the developers, and then you could actually bring that into your GIS, and you can essentially poach a lot of information from that. If they've got the parcels, if they've got, different utility information. A lot of folks, we build as-builts for them based on that information. But this is a really great way to get the information that you need. Remember that geometry has a meaning. So the way that you draw in the roads has a meaning, right? So you want to draw them in the direction of the increasing addresses. And then, of course, if you are trying to build a routable network, like for closest unit routing or just for, routing analysis in GIS, you're going to have to consider other fields as well. So like one-way, speed limit, cost, etc. Those are not required fields in the data model, but they are required if you want to build a routable network. Okay, so you have to think about the intent of the data and then populate the fields accordingly. So managing road center lines in GIS, really you want to make sure that the geometry, like the way that things are drawn in, as well as the attributes, are reflecting what's going on in the real world. Okay. Roundabouts. A lot of communities are switching to roundabouts because they traffic flows more smoothly, and you also they also lose that maintenance cost with streetlights. So a lot of communities are switching to roundabouts. You want to make sure that that stuff is reflected in the GIS when it happens. You don't want to like sit on it and wait. Parse your street elements into separate fields. So, North Main Street has to be in 3 separate fields. You want to make sure that you're splitting and snapping road center lines, not only at intersections with other road center lines, but also at boundaries. So country, state, county, incorporated municipality, neighborhood community, unincorporated community, and ESN. Anytime basically you would have an attribute change in one of those fields, you're going to need to split your road center line and update it. So when you have an annexation, even if your annexation does not lead to a change in your PSAT boundary, it is going to lead to a change in your addresses and your roads because that community information has now changed. So you're going to need to go through and make sure that you've made those updates. Digitize in the direction of increasing addresses. Avoid paper streets. What is a paper street? A paper street is basically a street that is platted but not built. So it's something where, you may see it in the parcel right of way, But if you actually look at the aerial or you go out there in real life, there's nothing out there. Could be like a field, could be overgrown. There could be like a tractor trailer sitting there. Like it's essentially a platted right of way that's never going to get built. I always recommend that you take those out of the active master road center lines because, again, the geometry has meaning. When in your road center lines, what you're saying with that file is that's a real traversable street. And look at bullet point number 1. They need to reflect what's going on in the real world. So if it's not a real traversable street, then you need to get it out of there and put it in a separate file. Okay. It just doesn't make sense, especially if you're building something that's routable, because the road's never going to be built, so you can't cross it. But if it's in your data and you don't have the attributes filled out appropriately, it's going to impact the routing. All right. I do recommend that people move the driveways to a separate file. Look, you can keep your driveways in your road center lines if you want to, okay? And actually, if you look at the GIS data stewardship document that I referenced earlier, that informational document, there is a note in there about that. It's not wrong to put your driveways in your road center lines. However, you are going to be holding your driveways to the same standards that you are your road center lines. In other words, you're going to have to snap them. You're going to have to snap the center lines at the intersections. You're also going to need to name them, not name them necessarily, but you're going to have to provide all of the documentation within those attributes that's required. Okay, so they're going to be held to the same standard as your road center lines. So all of those fields that are required within the road center lines, you're going to have to use them to populate your driveways. Now, one way to get around this in the toolkit is you can mark them as a no for submission so that the driveways are not actually submitted. But your next generation core services provider might have a different perspective over that. Okay. So I'm just saying my recommendation and best practice is to move them out into a separate driveways file. I don't keep them in the master road center lines file. Okay, address points. Same. Geometry and attributes need to reflect what's going on in the real world. Okay. Think about accuracy versus precision. This is really going to impact, how we place our address points. So are we doing a parcel placement methodology or are we doing structure? For the attributes, you want to make sure that you're parsing the address elements into individual fields. Okay, so 100 North Main Street, apartment 7. Those are all going to go in their own individual fields. Okay, and you can reference the CLDXF document, and I'll pull that up right now. I might show this later on. I can't recall, but there is, I want to say, so we're sorry, making everybody nauseous here. I want to say it was page in the back of the CLDXF document. I've got it here, name type. In the back of this document, it does show you how to parse out your addressing elements. Again, this is in the CLDXF Civic Location Data Exchange format. This is NENA Standard 004.1.1-2014. This has fantastic information about how to parse out these addresses that might be confusing. So like the half addresses, it tells you, hey, move it into the suffix, right? B, etc. So there's a lot of really good information in here. But that's how you would parse. Okay, pull up that document and research it to make sure that you're putting the appropriate elements in the right fields. Use consistent placement methodology. So there's different ways to place address points, and we're going to talk about that here in a few. Manage subaddresses. That is super helpful for your first responders. Okay, can also help you with additional calculations that you need to make. If you need to, calculate dwelling units or whatever, if that information is not already populated within your parcels data or in some other data or database, you can do a calculation and query against your GIS. Can be very helpful. Okay, so placement methodologies. The first is a geocoding. This is basically saying, okay, I'm going to place my address point based on where it falls within the road centerline range. Parcel centroids. It's really just going to place an address at the center of the parcel. So if you look at the top graphic, that is indicative of a parcel placement. So you're basically just putting the point in the middle of the parcel. A site is really just a location like a park, for example, with no defined boundary or structure. So a general best practice is to place a point in the middle of the site. The structure placement is actually within the building footprint. And the property access placement is at the access to the property. So geocoding, again, and these screenshots did come out of the site structure address point informational document. So if you want to go back and reference that, you can. But basically, at the top, these are examples of actual ranges, right? You have an even distribution of address points based on the actual range. So you have a high of 170, you have a low of 133, and those are scattered evenly along the road center line because that's what the range is. And then if you look at the potential, or what we call theoretical range, all of those addresses, because the range is 133 to 170, you can see where they're all concentrated and clustered in the middle because the range was 100 to 199. So that spatially is uneven, but that's a geocoding or calculated placement. Parcel centroid is essentially placing the parcel or placing the address point in the middle of the parcel. This is super easy to generate using GIS, just developing the center of a parcel. So if you don't have address points and you want to get a good start, if you have a good parcel data set, this is a great way to get started on that, is to just generate a parcel centroid with all of, with the addresses essentially. So this is a graphic there. And again, this came from the informational document. Site placement would be just taking a general placement in the middle of the site. So this is a park site, and putting the address right in the middle. And it's referencing the entire site itself, which could include obviously, pavilions, swimming pool, RV, or whatever, tracks, whatever's at parks. This could be used to represent that. So it'd be one address for the single site. Structure placement. Structure placement is placing the address point on top of the structure. Okay. This is the most accurate for NG911, and I will show you an example of that in the table here in just a second. But this is structure placement. This is the most desirable. And then property access placement is essentially putting the address at the access way of the property. And one of the options given was at the right-of-way line. So some people will place it here on the property line. Some people will place it down here. It really just depends. But there are advantages and disadvantages to doing this, and I highly recommend that you read through that. But lots of different ways to place address points. So here is a table, and again, this table was pulled out of that informational document, the table that references the placement methodologies for public safety applications. So 1 star is least desirable, and 3 stars is most desirable. So it gives you the different placement methodologies on the left-hand side, and then the different public safety applications on the top. Okay, so for next generation 911 location validation and call routing, the structure placement is the best because it's the most precise. geocoding and property access for NG911 are least precise, and site and parcel are just they're just okay. All right, structure placement is the best for NG911. For 911 map display, structure placement is also the best. Okay, for CAD, structure placement is also the best. Again, precision. Vehicle routing, structure placement is not the best. Look at what is property access. Okay, so here's where you guys could develop a separate data set that's just used to annotate your property access. Okay, we call those access points. So you're developing a separate feature class or shapefile just for access points. Those are points of entry into properties, and you can associate like gate codes with them, any additional information you may need. Okay, but the reason why structure placement is not ideal for vehicle routing is obviously because often the vehicles have to go, you know, the structure may be a long way from the actual roadway or the entrance to that property. So that's why it's always a good idea to develop those access points. And then for emergency notification, again, structure is the most accurate. Okay. But again, this is not saying that you can't use parcel-based addressing for NG911. It's just not the most precise. Okay, now we're going to move into creating sustainable addressing workflows, which is very important. This is where I see a lot of things that kind of can go awry. So let's talk about some ways that we can mitigate that. So first of all, understanding your role as an addressing authority is extremely important. We talked earlier about how your addresses need to be assigned in a logical and consistent manner to support public safety first responders. Okay. Logical and consistent and easy. Okay, remember, we're trying to get there in an emergency. We're trying to get there at night. We're trying to get there in adverse conditions. Like, we need to make sure that our addressing system is easy to follow. Okay, follow the best practices that we talked about earlier for addressing and road naming. Make sure that you are adding your GIS data into your main data within 3 business days. Now, the discrepancy report that comes out of your next generation core services, the expectation there is that you're going to resolve that. We're saying 3 business days. It says 72 hours. It's just a vague reference. I think as time goes on, that's going to increase our understanding of what that actually means. But that means that when your data passes through the toolkit, it's uploaded into the repository, and then that data set is taken and provisioned into your core services provider, they're going to run their additional checks and balances on that data. And what they're going to do is return back to you a list of anomalies or errors that are generated from their validation run. And the expectation is that those are going to be resolved within 3 business days. Okay. You want to make sure that you are engaging public safety for road name and plan review, and also for unique addressing scenarios. If you look at the NINA informational document for that site structure address point placement, it's always going to tell you to default back to the local addressing authority for the best practices, but also to reference public safety, because they're really going to be the ones, like if you get a plan that's got a lot of mixed use and you've got different parts of that building being accessed from different right of way, I mean, they're going to be able to help guide you in the best way to assign that address that's conducive for public safety response. Okay, make sure that you're resolving addressing discrepancies as you get them. You want to make sure that as your first responders are reporting those discrepancies, whether they occur in the real world or they're just in the GIS data, you want to make sure that you're documenting that and you're staying on top of it and you're correcting it. And most importantly, that you are letting them know that that's been resolved and you're providing updated and refreshed data. So for an appropriate NG911 workflow, it's really important that you have clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Your addressing authority, whoever is managing your road center lines, which may be different than the addressing people, your public safety folks, and your GIS, you want to get everybody together and understand who's doing what. That's extremely important. There are so many places that have siloed workflows where people are not coming together. There's confusion about who's managing the data, and it just makes things more challenging overall when you have that type of situation. Communication and education is extremely important among all stakeholders. If you have stakeholders who are consistently making mistakes, like as far as assigning addresses, etc., you want to make sure that you're bringing them in, getting them the education that they need to help them understand, hey, we really need to change up what we're doing because it's creating an issue for public safety. In some extreme cases, I have had to recommend in my strategic plans that the addressing authority be moved from one department to another, just because it's creating more of a liability than anything else. Data editing and management, you've got to have an established workflow for that. You really want to make sure that you're following the data model and you're using the toolkit to help validate your data. Keeping your public safety systems up to date is extremely important. A lot of folks that we talk to say, oh, we only update our CAD system, once a year or something. That is not helping your dispatchers or your first responders. You really want to make sure that everybody has got up to date and refreshed GIS data as soon as it's available. And then, of course, mitigating risks, which is extremely important. And, regular QC is very important for that. So your responsibilities as public safety, I want you guys to start engaging in the addressing and road center line process. Okay, identify discrepancies and problem areas and work with your addressing and road center line authorities to mitigate those issues. Also, make sure you're assisting with data creation for your ESBs and your ESZs. Those are not GIS decisions. Those are not addressing authority decisions. Those are public safety decisions. So you want to be engaged there. Have boundary facilitation meetings with your neighbors. We do talk about this in the boundary class. Actively engage in updating your MSAG and alley. If new roads are going in the community, somebody's going to have to update that in the MSAG to make sure that that information is captured. And then, of course, as you bring new vendors in that are consuming the GIS data in some way, you're going to want to make sure that you understand what they require of the GIS data, because you may have your GIS data built out to meet the toolkit requirements, but the vendor may have additional data requirements that maybe you didn't consider. So these could be like different fields, or for example, you may need to move addresses that have a 0 address into a separate field and call them something else. Like, each vendor is going to have a different requirement of the data, whether they are a CAD vendor or 911 or core services. So for GIS, you want to make sure that you have skilled staff that are tasked with managing this GIS data. I cannot stress enough that GIS data management for next generation 911, it's the most important GIS that you're ever going to do. You are geospatial first responders. Let that sink in for a minute. You are managing data and editing data that is going to be used before a 911 call ever comes into a PSAP. That data is being used. So your data is the first one really on the scene. You want to make sure that you have the most skilled staff responsible managing that. The next thing is that you want to cooperate with public safety and the addressing authority to create and manage those GIS layers that are required for NG911. Become familiar with the data model. NG911 changes how we manage our GIS data. So you want to be super familiar with the data model, the state data model, and also the toolkit. We do have a toolkit course. It's available online. We highly recommend that you walk through that and get to know that, because that is going to need to be run iteratively. Okay. It's not just a one and done on those validations. You're going to want to make sure that you're validating that GIS data on a regular basis. And the more frequent that you're editing that data, the more frequently you need to validate that data. So communication and education is so very important among these different agencies. Okay. I highly recommend that you all establish a review process for addressing and road center lines. It's very important. You can form an addressing committee if you want to with different stakeholders. It really just depends on the size of your community and who's involved with that. But definitely a review process can be very beneficial on keeping people aware of what's going on in the community, and also making sure that things are being done in a way that's conducive to public safety, while also meeting the business needs required by everyone else that consumes this information. You want to make sure that you have a discrepancy feedback loop. You want to make sure that when people notify you of a discrepancy, either that occurs in the real world or something that occurs within the GIS data, that you have that documented. I always recommend that you check with your IT department to see if they've got a ticketing system in place. A lot of them have extra licenses that you can, latch onto and use. So I highly recommend that you do that, because that provides a date and timestamp and a record. Okay, and you can most of the time respond to that and give people updates. So I highly recommend that you do that. Education for data managers. We have the toolkit class. There's the data model. There's lots of different documents out there to help with that data management piece. And I highly recommend that if you are new to GIS or new to managing data for public safety, that you immerse yourself in that. You also need education for non-public safety staff. So if you have people who are involved in assigning addresses or managing road center lines that don't know about public safety, it's very important to bring them into the fold so that they can be educated on what the best practices are. It's very important for risk mitigation to have education. Okay. And I harp a lot on education for that reason. You can't hold people responsible for what they don't know. It's up to public safety folks to provide the best and most accurate and most complete data set into the core services that you possibly can. That's the responsibility of public safety. Okay. So you really need to be very proactive in educating people and kind of evangelizing this message of next generation 911. Go through your community. Hey, what are we doing for this? Go to your GIS people. Hey, have you taken the toolkit class? It's really, really important. Okay. Implement best practices. I've already provided them to you. If you don't have an addressing ordinance, get one. The addressing ordinance is the codified legal support that your addressing authority needs to be able to do its job. Okay, you can't fix things if you don't have the legal backing, you don't have administrative support. Make sure you have that ordinance, because what you don't want to end up with is a litigation situation that puts you in the news. We're seeing that more and more and more, and it's concerning. Lots of 911 calls being released where people can't describe where they are and public safety can't find them. You don't want to be one of those, because everybody thinks that it can't happen to them. And unfortunately, when Datamark is called in, a lot of times to fix these things, it's already after the fact. So it's more of a reactive approach. Be proactive. Implement best practices for data management. Create a QA culture. It's so incredibly important. Run your data through the GIS toolkit. Become very intimately familiar with the toolkit. You want to make sure that you're comfortable with it and that you're using it. Using it once a year is not going to be good enough. If you don't feel like you have the knowledge, skills, or abilities to use the toolkit, or if you don't have the software or the resources, get a vendor to help you. There is grant funding available right now that you can pursue to get help with that part of the project. Okay. So for your ordinances and SOPs, you want to make sure that you're establishing who the addressing authority is and what their responsibility is. You want to make sure that the ordinance establishes the addressing and road naming requirements, as well as the signage standards and requirements. The assignment and road naming is just one piece. Like, if you can have a perfect addressing system on paper in your GIS, but if none of that is posted and you're not enforcing that signage, no matter how perfect your addressing system is, it's still going to create confusion for your first responders. Okay. The addresses must be posted in order for things to make sense out in the field. And then your ordinance also needs to document what your enforcement process is. Is that fines? Is that court? Is that jail time? And follow that enforcement process. Your SOPs. Your SOPs should document the full process of assigning an address. Okay. It should define the roles and responsibilities and what positions and departments are in charge of providing whatever information is needed for your process. It should also detail the assignment process from start to finish. What does that communication pathway look like? If I'm getting a request from a citizen, how do I go through and notify that citizen? Do I send a certified letter? Do I send an email? Do I just print out a letter in my office and hand it to them in person? You need to document all of this stuff. And how does that information get communicated out to other departments or other agencies? So a complete addressing lifecycle should begin with the addressing request. So my request comes in, then what? First of all, you need to wrap requirements around that request. What does that request involve? For me, it involves a recorded plat, or it involves a hand-drawn map that shows the property lines, the parcel identification number, the structure location, and the driveway at a minimum. Okay. You may require additional paperwork. Some people require that a building permit is initiated. That's done at the local level. Your community may not even require building permits, so you might have a different request process. But make sure that you are providing color and context around each one of these components when you're documenting your SOPs. Address assignment. What does my process look like? I get the address request. Then what? Do I reference an old map? Do I go into my GIS? What am I doing? Am I looking at just the numbers on either side and across the street and making an interpolated guess? What is your assignment process? What do you do? Do you take a measurement along the road center line and divide it by a unit of measurement? What does that process look like? That needs to be defined. Okay. And ideally, you want to wrap a timeline around this entire process. I would say all of this should be within 3 business days. I don't think it's that difficult. I also think that you all need to have someone else trained as a backup to help you with that. So you can go on vacation, you can go, take leave and do what you need to do. And that process remains uninterrupted. I've talked to so many people who have said, oh, yeah, I come back and I've got 50 addresses to assign and I'm gone for a week. That's unacceptable. A lot of people rely on addresses for their business needs. Okay. You should have 2, maybe 3 people if you're in a bigger locality that knows how to do your job. Okay. So I assign the address. What does that mean? I'm going to document that whole process. Then that address is going to be entered into GIS. Maybe it's already entered into GIS by virtue of the actual assignment process. This is going to be different depending on the locality. Okay. Maybe I'm the addressing authority, but I don't do anything with GIS. I just write the address on the permit and then I forward it on. That's fine. That needs to be documented. Okay. So whoever is assigning the address, what is that process? Whoever is entering the address into GIS, what is that process? All of that needs to be thoroughly documented. Okay. After it's entered into GIS, it becomes part of, and what I didn't put in here was the toolkit. Okay. And that's because that process is going to depend on the volume of editing. Okay. You don't have to run the toolkit every single time you assign an address. Okay. If you assign, 2 addresses a month, it may not be appropriate for you to run the toolkit every month. Maybe you'll want to do it every 2 months, or maybe you'll just want to run it quarterly if you have a very minimal editing workflow. Okay. But you do want to make sure that that address is QC'd and that it's accurate. Okay. Then you want to make sure that it's provisioned into public safety. You make the data available. It doesn't do any good to anyone if it's just sitting on an isolated server and no one can use it. So provision into public safety means you're providing it to your public safety folks in whatever format they need. Is it a feature class? Is it a shapefile? Whatever they need, you're going to provide it to them. They may use it in their CAD. They may use it in their 911 system. They may use it in other systems. You're obviously, as the GIS authority, you're going to push that into the state's repository. And that's something that everybody is going to have to do. Okay, now, once you provide that to public safety, they're going to use it for their business needs, and they may have a different update cycle. Okay, but as the GIS authority and the addressing authority, it's up to you all to make sure that the most up-to-date data is provided. Okay, and then from there, public safety, I think, has a very special role because they're going to be the primary folks who report discrepancies. Whether, again, that's in real life or if that's in the GIS data, they're going to need to review and document that and then provide that out to everyone else. Okay, so what does that look like? Is that an email? Is that a ticketing system? We want to make sure that we're not just jotting things down on paper and putting paper on people's desks. Let's make it something that has a date and timestamp. Let's get into the habit of saying, yes, within 3 business days, I'm going to have this investigated and corrected. Okay, so now I'm going to review with you all some local questions that were submitted from the folks who attended the on-site training. So some examples of correction lines were provided, and generally the grids are separate from correction lines, but you can offset it to align with the rest of the addresses, but just do the best you can. I don't have a particular calculation. I guess you would just have to measure. It says a little bit more than half a mile, so you have to make that measurement and then correct your addresses because these are not, truly connected streets. So duplicate stacked road segments that have the same address ranges, but east side of the road is addressed off of one street and the west side is addressed off another. If I put an alternate road name in, will it be able to go through the toolkit? No. Alternate or alias names are not used in NG911 call routing. They're not even in the model. Okay. There is a separate table for alias names, but those are not in the model for road center lines. Okay. So essentially, you're going to need to use only the primary name for NG911 call routing. So I recommend using 2 road center lines for each road name. If they are officially named roads and if their address is assigned off of them, represent them as 2 separate segments. If you look at that GIS data stewardship model there, or informational document, I should say, there is plenty of information in there about how to handle that road center line situation. Okay. So when a city creates addressing standards, there's a 0.0. Basically, the point of this question is to ask, is there a standard in place to how to deal with city county addressing? As far as, you go from city to county, or if there's an annexation. So the answer is this is always determined locally. All right, the state does not have standards developed or best practices for handling annexations and changing addresses. Essentially, you want to make sure that you're being thoughtful. Usually an annexation is for tax base. It's to increase your tax base. It's usually annexing of businesses. So you have to decide how difficult you want to make the process for the businesses, because if you change the address, then you're going to have a lot of backlash from the businesses. For me, I don't care either way. I just think that you need to be consistent with whatever it is you're doing. I think you need to be also consistent in enforcing it. So like you can't, what you don't want is one business chooses, one business is encompassed in an annexation and chooses not to change their address. And then, further down the street, another business is encompassed by an annexation and they do change. So now you've got addresses that are out of order. You need to be thorough and consistent no matter what you decide to do. But the state does not have any guidelines concerning this. Okay. There was another question about highways changing directionality, and our advice is always to keep addressing as consistent as possible within your system. Another question concerned a town where all of the addresses were issued with south redirectionals, and addresses that fall above the north-south boundary are not recognized, and packages and sometimes mail are delivered to vacant properties and those matching addresses that are in the south section. And I recommend that if you have an addressing situation that is making it so you've got wrong deliveries, then you probably should, especially if there's a public safety issue confusion, then you probably should mark that area for an addressing change. So another question was concerning the power company. So the power company is not an addressing authority. They have old systems that have old data. It is not under their purview to tell somebody what their address is. The addressing authority is within the local government, and they should issue an address and assign that address and document it on local government letterhead, and meet with the higher ups to communicate that information and say, look, this is what the address is. You all need to change your records. It's not the other way around. Procedure. So this is a procedure question. When we send out address changes on residences or commercial properties, what is the best way to ensure that they begin using the legally correct address? They'll send out multiple letters. Some property owners change their address, but others ignore it and keep using the old address. This is where I need you guys to document your ordinances. Document it, have your county or city or town attorney review it, and develop an ordinance that defines all of the things that we talked about, right? Who's the authority? What can they do? What is their responsibility? What is the addressing for? If it's creating a problem for public safety and the ordinance is saying, hey, addressing is for public safety, that's a direct violation of the ordinance. On a commercial property, you can have the fire marshal identify the insurance company, and he can then reach out to them directly and notify of an unresolved addressing issue. I actually became aware of this recently in a different town where they were having to change addresses of a lot of commercial buildings. They were being fought about it, and the fire marshal basically wrote a letter, and the insurance company will threaten to cancel them if they don't change it immediately. So you need to make sure that you have a very clearly defined addressing ordinance and make sure that you follow that violation process. I have been to court. The judge finds it very unpleasant and disrespectful when lots of public servants are brought in and put on a bench in a court, wasting taxpayer dollars in the day because somebody didn't want to change the numbers on their house. Yes, it's an inconvenience. It's a real bummer, but so is dying because 911 can't find you. So I am very unsympathetic about that. Numbers are sold everywhere, and you really have like a year to change your address. So that's the process. Okay. The road segment is outside of the PSAT boundary that the buildings on the north side of the road are addressed off of. Also have an issue with the ranges of being out of order. Solution was to mark the road as an exception outside the boundary. Need a little bit more context here, but marking it outside the discrepancy agency boundary is acceptable. And if you want more information, I would recommend that you see the boundary class that's out on the web as well. You can have out of order ranges that is acceptable in the NINA data model. And then most range issues, when you run the toolkit, most range issues are going to flag as a notice and not an error. Notices do not prevent submission. Errors do. Okay. One side of the street is addressed off South Glen. The other side is East 147th Street South. Solution was to draw segments that don't touch except for intersections. Ranges on the inside are zeros. Addresses on the right of 147th has the correct range. So this is an appropriate solution. And we kind of talked about it earlier where you've got roads that are on a divided highway. You can also have this where you've got roads that are two different road names, or where you've got, one side of the street is addressed off of one and the other is off of the other. And again, there's a lot more information in here in the GIS data stewardship document, the informational document, that show you a lot of really good examples. Address points using 146th Street South. The range in the area is West Main Street. The solution is to change the addresses to West Main. The ranges are correct. The street name is West Main Street with the alternate name is West 146th Street South. So you need to make sure that the addresses are reflecting what the real primary road name is in the GIS. And you also want to make sure that they are changed in real life, because people are going to be calling and saying one address. It's not necessarily an issue for call routing, but it definitely is for resource routing. So you want to make sure that the changes are being reflected in the real world and within the GIS data. Honorary street name best practices. Look, this is something that's come up recently, but you can only have one primary street name for call routing. Okay. I think that having multiple street names can be confusing for 911 callers, because what street name do you give when you call 911? Is it the brown sign or is it the blue or green sign? Okay, so I think it does add a layer of complexity. There's no guidance in the national standards for how to document or manage honorary street names. But it does say that you can put alias names in a separate alias table, but alias names are not used for call routing. Okay. And that's where I put this little snippet. The NG911 GIS data model allows for only one primary street name. Using alias street names to resolve an issue is not an option, given the guidance in the NENA information document for LVF, which is the location validation function, which states alias names shall not be used when determining if a specific location is valid. So that's the point. Okay, it's one primary. I understand the goal of honorary street names. It's a very kind thing to do. It's a very respectable thing to do, a way to honor someone in the community. But I think there are other ways to do it besides putting up another street sign and creating confusion for 911 callers. Okay, county borders where there's a road running along the county line and each county has a road named differently with different road ranges. What should we do? So my question is what do the roads reflect and what are the addresses? So if everything is reflecting the correct information, where you have 0, 0 ranges on one side and then the correct ranges on the opposing side for the appropriate county, then you could offset the road center line slightly to avoid a geometry overlap. This is one of those things that is going to be an ongoing conversation with the next gen core services provider. So I highly recommend that you stay engaged with that, and anything that's on a county line or a border, that is going to be something that you want to engage with your core services. Highways and naming. How do I parse the name across fields? Well, I showed you earlier the civic location data exchange. This is the table that we reviewed, and we looked at addresses earlier, but if we scroll up, there are, starting on page 120 of this document, it shows you actually how to parse these names. Okay, so it gives you examples of how to parse these out in the model. Okay. When do I assign a new road name? When is it legally required? And when is it a best management practice? Well, that is all determined locally. But I can tell you a best practice The best practice is 2 or more, but you could do 3 or more when you have 3 or more that share a right of way, then you can name the road. Okay. So legally required is going to be up to you at the local level. But a best practice is to, wait till you get that third house that's coming in and then change everybody's address. What do I do when a road has multiple names and ranges that overlap and are not the same? So I would say it depends on the circumstances. A lot of these were submitted without screenshots, so I without additional context graphically, it's hard for me to provide appropriate guidance. But if it's a boundary road between municipalities, there are different solutions. If you have addresses that are out of order and causing a problem for public safety, then you need to consider a readdressing. Again, look at the GIS data stewardship informational document and you will see a lot of information in there about that. What is the addressing schema within the PSAP? A potential address every 5.28, block ranges, actual theoretical both. Can you combine them? Yes, you can combine different addressing systems within a county. You can also combine different ways of managing the range data. This is also in the data stewardship document. You can combine them. You don't want to, for the sake of consistency, just make a generalization that everything is going to be theoretical ranges, because then that can have implications on the geocoding for your rural areas. So you want to make sure that you're making thoughtful considerations about the GIS data management before you just go in and blanket say, hey, I've got to do all of these the same way. Yes, you can combine them and you should, based on the individual circumstances. So this concludes the addressing presentation, the addressing workshop. I recommend that any questions be directed to Shelley Willoughby, and thank you for joining today.